morning and welcome to the Geneva Press Club here online. Welcome to our distinguished and eminent panelists of today, expert in international law for most of them. We will talk about today about racist police in the USA found guilty of crimes against humanity. This is the title of this special session. Thank you for all of you for coming here, to those who are with us on Zoom, and also for all those who follow us on our website of the Geneva Press Club at www.pressclub.ch, or you can follow us also on our YouTube channel or on Facebook Live. So thank you very much. And this session will be led by Kerry Mclean. Hi, Kerry, good to see you today. And Kerry will give the floor to each of the speakers today. Kerry is an international human rights lawyer. She is a member of the steering committee that organized the Commission of Inquiry, and she is also the Commission of Inquiry's spokesperson. So, Kerry, you will moderate this panel, and I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Greetings. As Pierre said, my name is Kerry Mclean, and I'm a member of the steering committee that organized the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the United States. Welcome to all of you who joined us from different countries for today's press conference. Racist police violence has been a scourge in the United States since the end of slavery. Black people in the United States and our allies have long engaged in struggle to survive and eradicate that violence. In June 2020, following the brutal murder of George Floyd, which has since been witnessed by the world on video, an international coalition of hundreds of organizations and individuals sent a communication to the UN Human Rights Council urging that the UN convene a commission of inquiry to investigate racism and racist police violence in the United States. In an unprecedented move, the UN African Group followed up on that request, requesting an urgent debate on racism at the UN Human Rights Council and also calling for a commission of inquiry to investigate racism. We learned from our contacts that the US pressured some countries to oppose a commission of inquiry. The Human Rights Council declined the request to convene a commission of inquiry, though it did task the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights with preparing a report on racism. Following the UN's decision to not convene a commission of inquiry, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the National Lawyers Guild, and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers decided to convene a commission of inquiry to conduct a thorough and impartial investigation of police violence in the US that the community had demanded. The Commission of Inquiry's mandate was to investigate the systemic, widespread, and grave violations of the rights of Black people by police in the United States and present its findings and recommendations in a report. We assembled a team of 12 experts, commissioners, none of whom are from the United States, to conduct the investigations in an independent and impartial manner. Our commissioners hail from Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda, Pakistan, South Africa, Japan, India, Nigeria, France, Costa Rica, and the United Kingdom. We conducted live hearings of 44 cases where the commissioners heard testimony from the family members of victims of police violence, testimony from lawyers who represent the families of victims, and testimony from community activists. The commissioners also reviewed reports, legislation, and other relevant materials. The Commission of Inquiry conducted a thorough investigation into anti-Black violence perpetrated by police in the United States, both historically and in recent times, with an emphasis on evaluating the most recent cases and addressing the connection of the current cases to the history of systemic racism. We concluded our live hearings of cases in February, and our commissioners worked alongside a team of rapporteurs to prepare a report. The report has been shared with the UN High Commissioner and shared with the public via press conferences in the United States, as well as press conferences throughout Africa. You might have seen news articles about our report in the Guardian newspaper and Newsweek. We hope that our report will be utilized widely and serve as a resource to the community. Some of our commissioners are here today to present some of the findings and recommendations from the report. We will also hear from the family member of a victim of police violence. We ask for your solidarity and support in advancing the report and seeking implementation of its recommendations. We have several speakers, so let's move forward. I'm honored to introduce Mr. Philonis Floyd. His brother George was brutally murdered by the police. Philonis?
Hello?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
The picture, I couldn't pull up a video. I don't know why, but it's okay.
If you can open it now.
Okay. Start my video. You happy? Hello. How are you all? As you all know, I'm Philonis Floyd, the brother of George Floyd. It has been a year of just basically waking up every day, seeing your brother dying all the time. We grew up together, me and my family members. We never thought that we would see our brother killed in May, the day after my anniversary. It was horrific. It was 3 police officers who showed no remorse and no respect. The things that they did to my brother, I wouldn't have did that to an animal. Um, They've stayed on his neck. Mr. Chauvin stayed on my brother's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds with a smirk on his face, with his hands in his pockets. People pleaded for his life over and over again. It was disgusting and it was horrific to all those kids and all those adults who had to stay out there and witness such a crime in broad daylight. That was a modern day lynching. This was something that we never would thought that we would see in this time, in this day, but technology has proved it to all around the world, all around this nation. When you look at Ghana, you look at Switzerland, you look at Ireland, you look at Germany, you look at so many different places, people have stood behind George Floyd. And this is one of the biggest reasons that we need to push this George Floyd Policing Act, because we always have to understand that it's our duty to speak for the living and to speak for the dead, because they can't speak for themselves. And the only weapon that these people had was the color of their skin. We always got to remember that we have to choose love over hate. We have to choose friend over foe, and we always have to have equality over division. Because anytime we stand together in solidarity and unity with each other, we can always prosper to the top. I wouldn't be here with you all today if I didn't believe that you all had that savvy, that tough, and a lot of grit, just like us, because it takes a lot of courage to get out and speak about what's going on in today's society. The police that my brother met, they should have treated him with respect over a $20 accusation. I have seen individuals shoot up church houses and then they go have Burger King with them at dinner. He should have been treated with support, dignity, respect, just like I've seen others. The time that I have to sit here and witness all of these murders right after my brother is very, very devastating to me. 10 miles away from where I was fighting for accountability for my brother, Dante Wright was murdered. It was a sad situation, and I had to get out there and help console another mother. And all of these family members, it's hard for them to get out and speak about what's going on because they're hurt. They have a lot of pain. They have the same pain that I felt, the same pain that anybody feels when they lose someone that they love. People have to understand that we have to pass this law because it's blood all on this bill. You have to go and look at um, you can go back to Trayvon Martin. You can go back to Rodney King. All of these people, they all been hurt by police officers, and some of them are not even here today. And that's a sad situation that we're losing young brothers And also, we're using even mothers like Pamela Turner in Baytown. She was killed right there, right by her. The cop shot her over and over again, and she pleaded and she told him that she was pregnant, and he still shot her. And that's like 40 minutes from where I stay in Houston, Texas. It's not a good thing right now in the society. So we will continue having to speak up for everybody all across this world, and I will continue to do that in solidarity and stand in unity with everybody. I thank you all so much just for having me here today, because my family has been given a life sentence, and there's so many other families across America who have been given a life sentence due to police brutality. And this is something we must stop, because this is one of the biggest reasons I started my institution called the Philonis and Keita Floyd Institution for Social Change. We're turning our pain into purpose to get out and fight for these families, to make sure that these kids be able to succeed in life. We're gonna help with youth enrichment. We're gonna help with criminal reform, police reform. And like I always say all the time, we will continue to be able to speak with public officials anytime they give us this opportunity to, because if I have to try to change laws every day, I will, because I love people and I don't care about the enemies that I receive, because the love that I have for people. Because if you can make federal laws to protect the bird, which is the bald eagle, you can make federal laws to protect people of color. It's a time for change, and that time is now. I thank you all so much for giving me this opportunity just to be able to get my perspective of what I'm talking about across to America. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Philonis. Thank you for being here. And, you know, I'm always inspired by you each time that you speak, inspired by your courage and just what you said about turning your pain into purpose. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is the coordinator of our project, Professor Lennox Hines.
Good afternoon and good morning, wherever you are. On behalf of the steering committee, permit me to welcome you to this press conference. The report, findings, and recommendations of this Commission of Inquiry resulted from the collective efforts of victim family members, lawyers who represented victim families, community activists, expert witnesses, commissioners, rapporteurs, and steering committee members. Without this collective participation, the Commission of Inquiry would not have existed. We thank and extend our condolences to the Floyd family and to all of the families of victims who had to relive the pain and horrors of the senseless, unjustified, and illegal executions of their loved ones at the hands of the police in the United States. The same police officers who are sworn to serve and protect, and instead served as executioners of our children, of our loved ones, and who, in all instances, the victims were unarmed, posing no threat or serious bodily harm to the police or to any third person. And in the words of one of the family members who testified, the only weapon that those victims had was the color of their skin. The world was aware and reacted with horror and outrage at the public lynching of George Floyd on May 25th of 2020. But the world was not aware of the killings of hundreds of other unarmed Black men and women. These were among the 44 cases heard by the commissioners over a 3-week period. Hearings were conducted 6 days a week. These cases heard by the commissioners spanned a 20-year period, and the killings occurred in 20 states and 33 cities, large cities, small cities across the United States, in the South, in the North, in the Midwest, the East, and the West. These cases heard by the commissioners represent only a tip of the iceberg of the hundreds of cases of Blacks and other minorities who are killed by the police every year. And their killers know that they can continue to maim, they can continue to cripple and kill Black and minority people without any expectation of judicial reprimand or punishment. Why? Because they operate behind the protective shield of racism. The commissioners heard testimony of the variety of methods used by the police in their wanton, malicious, and intentional killings of unarmed Black men, Black women, trans and gender non-conforming Black people across the United States. The victims were shot, tortured with tasers, inflicting 50,000 volts of electricity into the bodies of individuals suffering from mental illness. Some victims were suffocated. Some were choked to death. Others were killed when the police used their very vehicles as lethal weapons. In all cases, the victims were unarmed. On March 30th, 2021, the commissioner's report was filed with the Office of the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights. The report was publicly launched on April 27 at a news conference in the United States. Under the leadership of former Chief Justice of Kenya, Dr. Willie Mutunga, the report was launched on the African continent on May 18th in Southern Africa, on May 20th in Eastern Africa, on May 26th in West Africa. Briefings are being planned for the Congress of the United States, the Biden administration, and community activists. We note the duplicity and hypocrisy of the United States government, which claims to be a nation built upon the rule of law, yet chooses to operate beyond the reach of international law and systematically violates its own laws. It is noteworthy that neither President Joseph Biden or Secretary of State Anthony Blinken have made any commitment for the United States to sign the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and to submit that signed document to the United States Senate for ratification. All of the rhetoric and the promises of the United States government to honor human rights treaties and their criticism of other countries' human rights records ring hollow without the United States government submitting itself to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. We are asking the Human Rights Council to adopt the findings and recommendations of this International Commission and to hold the United States government to the same standards as all other member states and to question the integrity of its representatives for their hypocrisy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lennox. Okay, our next speaker is Commissioner Bert Samuels. Commissioner Samuels is the Deputy Chairman of the Jamaican National Council on Reparations and leads its legal working group. Bert?
Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Yes, as one of the commissioners, I am tasked to make a presentation on the findings of the International Commission of Inquiry on systemic racist police violence against people of African descent in the United States. As Mr. Hines has told you, we sat all together and listened individually in pairs to 44 cases of persons who have lost their relatives and friends and family for past 20 years in the United States. So we did not cover all the times in recent times. So I commence by saying no one, including the state, is allowed to violate the right to life. In practical terms, this means that no one should be arbitrarily deprived of their life. This statement is a summary of Article 6.1 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. The state has an obligation to investigate and punish violations of the right to life. This obligation must be independent, impartial, prompt, thorough, effective, credible, and transparent. The United States of America ratified the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights in 1992. All the cases heard by us, commissioners, in which Black people were killed, exhibited the arbitrary deprivation of life, of the right to life, against the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. There is also a clear breach of two other conventions. That is, one, the United Nations Convention Against the Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and secondly, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We commissioners have been able to conclude that the police in the United States of America have failed to conform their practices to the United Nations basic principles for the use of force by law enforcement, that is, the police. Almost all the killings we listened to were directed against Black people who at the time were unarmed and had committed, if at all, misdemeanors. That is, the police were consistently taking the lives of Black people in the context of stop and frisk, traffic stops, and alleged drug raids. Many of the encounters with Black people were in circumstances where there was no reason for law enforcement to approach them, as they were going about their homes, walking in their communities, or driving in their cars. We had a particular interest in traffic stops by the police. Commuting by motor car is prevalent in the United States, and in this context, traffic stops have become a common precursor to police killings of African Americans. Racially profiled Black men in particular, who are the drivers of high-end motor vehicles, are constantly stopped by white police officers. Very often, these stops commence with a chase, which in itself put the civilian Black drivers at risk. The commissioners found that unarmed Black drivers are often killed while seated in their cars with raised arms. Cases like that, who was unarmed at the time, Maduka Lamin, and shot to death, who had over 100 police officers firing over 200 shots at his car, is evidence of this. When compared to white people, the commission accepted the horrifying statistics that Black people were 3.5 times more likely to have, be killed by police than white people. And this statistic relates to Black people who had no weapons and in no way was attacking the police. Many findings of unsatisfactory violations of the right of Black people is that there was an absence of proper investigation and accountability. As a consequence, statistics show that only 1% of police killings in 2020 resulted in officer conviction. May I repeat? Only 1% of police killings in 2020 resulted in officer conviction. Arbitrary arrests and detention are prevalent in the Black community. Black people are stopped in their vehicles with regularity. The arbitrary arrests and detentions continue unabated, which has resulted in grave distrust of the police, so much so that community members, that is Black communities, do not call the police when they require assistance for fear of being targeted. The very people who pay their taxes who in turn pay the police officers. We looked also at whether trials were fair and the presumption of innocence. Arbitrary extrajudicial killings flies in the face of the presumption of innocence and the right to place alleged criminals on trial. The police become judge, jury, and executioner, and very often videotape evidence confirms the innocence of the victims of police killings. Our conclusion is that only crime committed on these crime scenes was that committed by the police themselves, who have taken the law into their own hands. America, with its minority black population, was found to be in breach of requirement of non-discrimination on the basis of race, gender, disability, and status as child, among other grounds. The United States has failed to demonstrate that it has taken a proactive stance to combat racially motivated violations within law enforcement operations. The United States must account for the fact that though black people account for 13% of the US population, they are killed at twice the rate of whites. On the other end of the spectrum, there's also an overrepresentation of African Americans in arrest and in their prison system. A worrying statistic is that black people with mental illness were targeted by police even in circumstances where they were called by family members to assist them in taking these persons to medical institutions. The risk of being killed during a police incident is 16 times greater with individuals with untreated mental illness than other civilians approached or stopped by officers. Approximately 8% of police killings involve persons experiencing mental health crises, and staggering 46.1% are persons of African descent. Transgender black women and girls, in violation of the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, were especially targeted by US cops. We looked at the prohibition against torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment in the United States. The forms of torture regularly used by US police on black people include tasers and compression asphyxia. There is this common chokehold and compression asphyxia. Chokeholds with the arms and compression asphyxia is done either by kneeling or standing on victims. Black people are routinely humiliated by police officers in the full view of the public, as George Floyd, handcuffing the victim face down and applying pressure to their necks and heads. For example, the commissioners heard about the killing of Eric Gardner. After being unlawfully stopped, eventually died from asphyxia when police placed him on his face and placed their entire weight on him. George Floyd was videotaped with Derek Chauvin placing his knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Shamefully, the Hennepin County medical examiner who looked at George Floyd's body made no physical finding to support a cause of death of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation. So that George Floyd's death does not only show misconduct on the part of the police, but misconduct on the part of medical examiners. Benjamin Crump, attorney at law for the family of George Floyd, informed the commission that chokeholds are legal in most cities in America, and this is applied over 75% of the times to men of color. In addition to chokeholds, the commission heard that police officers use their body weight to compress bodies of African American people. Now we turned and looked at the use of vehicles as deadly weapons against people of African descent. Yes, vehicles, police vehicles. There is what is called the rough ride. Police officers invariably handcuffed suspects with their backs, the hands behind their backs, shackling their feet together, and thereafter fastening their shackled feet to their cuffed hands. The victims then are placed in police van with no seat belt, and at the end of these rough rides, the victims are either dead or severely injured, being tossed from side to side during the journey. In Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Police deliberately chased Jeffrey Price while he was on his dirt bike, and the police cruiser chased him, causing a fatal accident at an intersection. Many of these use of vehicles as deadly weapons does not trigger an investigation. In other words, there is more talk about the use of firearms by police officers, but when their vehicles are used to kill Black people, an investigation is never instituted. Vehicular technique, which causes victims to be chased in fear of their lives and ultimately killed. The use of tasers is disproportionately used against Black people as against white people, and this constitutes a form of deadly force and torture. We also looked as commissioners at police failure to apply medical attention. There is a history of medical apartheid which is brought about because of the inadequate health facilities for Black people. In 13 of the 44 cases we heard, the commissioners found that the police's denial or failure to obtain timely medical attention contributed to the death of African Americans. We had particular interest in mental health and police practice. There is an overwhelming weight of testimonies before the commissioners that the police should not be the first responders for people suffering a mental health crisis. The police often suffocate mentally ill persons to death, being that they are not properly trained and react with deadly force, killing African American persons suffering mental disorders. Cherise Francis, for example, a Jamaican migrant, that is a Jamaican like myself, to the US, whose mother had called the police because Miss Francis was experiencing a medical health episode. Rather than assisting her to the hospital, a half an hour after the police arrived, Miss Francis was dead from asphyxia. There's also excessive use of force against transgender Black women, humiliating them, making them feel less than human during the episodes with police encounter. Most killings began with police responding to suspected non-violent offenses or in cases where no crime at all was reported. The Commission found specifically that US law does not comply with international law and standards on the use of force. The US has repeatedly failed to bring its domestic law in compliance with international law with respect to the use of lethal force. Within the judicial system, there was systemic impunity, complicit legal actors such as district attorneys, and the very troubling application of qualified immunity supports the Commission's findings of a policy which was guilty of widespread and systemic attack on people of color. We found that police killings amounted to a crime against humanity and murder. For the finding of a crime against humanity, a significant portion of the civilian population must face the threat of murder by the state. Today, 1 out of 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by police over the course of his life. Let me repeat that. 1 out of 1,000 Black men can expect in the United States to be killed by police over the course of his life. In the year 2020, 1,127 were killed by the police, of whom 28% were Black. I remind you that the population has 13% Black people. This qualifies as a finding of mass killings and hence a crime against humanity. There is also the crime of torture, the crime against humanity of torture. For there to be a violation of the United Nations it must be shown that a large class of the population is subjected to torture. The conclusion of the commissioners is that such a crime is present in the United States, with the frequent use of tasers, restraint, rough ride, and vehicular attack. The overall findings of the commissioners show a prima facie case that the people of color are subjected to persecution within the meaning of the Rome Statute. The fact that Black people are targeted by reason of identity, all the violent acts pointed out so far that result in death of several cases, is conclusive proof that as a group, African Americans are subject to crimes against humanity of persecution. In concluding, we would like the Paris press to hear that what has been left in this horrific human crisis facing Black people in America is that there is no domestic remedy available, and it therefore encourages a massive recurrence of violation. It is an indictment on the US that it voted against the Rome Statute that would protect its Black citizens in 1998. And though it signed it in the year 2000, it shamefully withdrew its signature in 2002. It is highly recommended by the Commission that the United States accede to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, being a democracy that should have nothing to hide regarding 13% of its population who helped to build the United States with 400 years of free labor during slavery. Finally, the commissioners recommend that the President signs the Rome Statute and transmit it to the US Senate to consent to ratification. Thanks for listening, and I hope that our voices will be heard through the four corners of the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bert, for that excellent presentation. Okay, we're going to move quickly to our next speaker, Commissioner Hina Jelani. Commissioner Jelani is the president of the World Organization Against Torture and a member of the Nelson Mandela-founded group of global leaders called the Elders. Hina?
Thank you very much. I wish to thank the Geneva Press Club for organizing this press conference and extend my welcome to the ladies and gentlemen of the press and others who are attending this press conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I would first like to remind you once again that the US played a critical role in drafting and adopting the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. These are three of the most important human rights treaties that protect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Black people in the United States in the context of policing. The provisions of treaties the US has ratified are a part of US law and are binding on all US states under the Supremacy Clause of the US Constitution. The protection of the rights enshrined in these treaties, as applied to law enforcement officers, are primarily codified in the Code of Conduct for Law Enforcement Officials and the United Nations Basic Principles on the Use of Force and Firearms by Law Enforcement Officials. Both the Code of Conduct and the UN principles are built around the protection of internationally recognized human rights, such as the right to human dignity, the right to life, prohibition against torture and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment, the right to mental health, and the right to equality and non-discrimination. I reminded you of these as a background to show the gap between what should be and what the reality is on the ground in the United States. The Commission has found that US laws and police practices do not comply with the international standards on the use of force, and this non-compliance has resulted in serious and repeated violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the African American population. The facts of the 44 cases examined by the Commission of African American people who were killed or maimed by the police revealed the structural racism embedded in the US legal and policing systems. Many of the serious violations recorded by the Commission resulted from the failure of law enforcement officials to fulfill their duties under the Code of Conduct, such as denial of and failure to secure medical attention for people in their custody, and in some cases, actively preventing medical treatment from being administered. All of the cases heard by the commissioners in which Black people were killed exhibited the arbitrary deprivation of the right to life and exposed failures of the police to adopt practices in compliance with the UN Basic Principles for the use of force by law enforcement. These arbitrary killings were unjust, unpredictable, done without due process of law, and in violation of the requirements of legality, necessity, and proportionality. The commissioners found unwarranted use of deadly force in all cases it examined, whether in the context of stop and frisk, traffic stops, alleged drug raids, or other types of encounters. We could see a clear pattern that evinced a disregard for Black life that also has implications for the principle of non-discrimination. The commissioners found that the police routinely subject Black people to arbitrary arrest or detention and to bodily harm during arrest and in detention, in violation of their Fourth Amendment rights and contrary to the provisions of international law. The incidences of racially biased and disproportionate traffic and investigatory stops, as well as other forms of order maintenance in particular, make visible the racial targeting of people of African descent for arbitrary arrest or detention. It became clear to us in the course of this inquiry that the principles of fair trial and presumption of innocence are seldom respected by the police in dealing with African American persons or communities. Unfortunately, in some cases, these principles are also not sufficiently protected by US laws. The commissioners found a pattern of race-based discrimination against people of African descent in the US, demonstrated not only by the disproportionate number of killings of Black people, but also in the racial profiling, pretextual traffic stops, order maintenance policing, and police violence against people of African descent. We see this as a systematic and widespread violation of fundamental principles of international human rights law. We were in particular disturbed to note violations of the right to non-discrimination for the killings of Black people with mental illness and against transgender Black women, girls, and femmes in violation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. The commissioners found violations of the international prohibition against torture and cruel, inhumane, and derogatory treatment in practices adopted by the police during arrest of Black people. It is also amply clear that the United States has failed in its duty to investigate and ensure effective remedies or hold to account when violations have occurred. The commissioners find that the police defense of qualified immunity amounts to condoning brutal police violence against persons of African descent and creates a culture of impunity whereby offenders are not held accountable and families are left without any remedy or redress. We have also found alarming evidence of obstruction of justice and collusion between various arms of law enforcement, prosecutors, coroners, and even medical examiners in connection with cases of the unjustified killings of persons of African descent. We have also been very troubled by the pattern of creating false narratives and smear campaigns directed at victims and their families. This aspect alone has a very negative impact, not just on individuals, but far-reaching impact also on communities. In the long term, we regret that such practices are creating a negative impact on racial relations in the United States. In the end, I would just like the members of the press to read the report. I recommend this report in particular for those who are fighting against discrimination, against racism, and those who are seeking to understand the human rights approach towards law enforcement, and those who are hoping that law enforcement practices, not just in the United States, but everywhere else, will change the way that we respect human rights and the rule of law. Finally, I would like to thank all my fellow commissioners, the rapporteurs, the steering committee that was able to help us to determine the consequences of those stories that we heard from victims and survivors. I really feel that our efforts were made possible by the families of the victims and the survivors who came forward to share their stories. I'm also grateful that they went beyond their own loss and grief to make sure that the world hears about what is happening in reality, and what we as human rights defenders and those who are fighting against racism all over the world must stand in solidarity and in unity. And I join Philonis Floyd in his call for asking for change and working even with more energy towards change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hina, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Commissioner Nilofer Bhagwat. Commissioner Bhagwat is the Vice President of the Indian Association of Lawyers and Vice President of the Confederation of Lawyers of Asia and the Pacific region. Nilofer?
Members of the press, we are having this press conference on an issue of significance and vital importance, not only to the people of the United States of America, but also with regard to minorities and the manner in which they are treated all over the world. As far as the recommendations addressed to the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner are concerned, the commissioners have come to a unanimous finding that it will not be possible to rectify the systemic and structural racism against citizens of African descent in the United States unless, pursuant to the resolution passed, Resolution 43.1 of the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations High Commissioner in her report directs the constitution by the UN Human Rights Commission of an independent commission of inquiry mandated to conduct a full investigation into incidents of police violence against people of African descent in the United States, and to determine in particular whether the level of violence constitutes gross violation of human rights and whether crimes under international criminal law have been and continue to be committed. Apart from our recommendation regarding the appointment of a commission of inquiry, we have also proposed that in order to establish a continuous process to monitor systemic racist police violence in the United States, the appointment by the UN Human Rights Commission of an independent expert on systemic racist violence in the United States is necessary. We also have recommended that in her report, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called for the demilitarization of law enforcement throughout the United States and called for an end to impunity and for accountability of police officials resorting to racist violence and unjustified force before independent civilian review boards and in criminal and civil proceedings of the justice system in the United States, as evidence was presented before us that there are very few convictions in respect of police officers who have actually murdered African Americans with impunity under the camouflage of policing functions. Apart from the recommendations addressed to the United Nations Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner, the commissioners have also addressed recommendations to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that on receipt of the report of the Commission of Inquiry, an investigation be launched into crimes against humanity under Article 7 of the ICC, pursuant to the prosecutor's powers under Rome Statute Article 15. We are aware that members of the press will question and direct our attention to the fact that the United States is not a signatory to and has not ratified the statute, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. However, we have also made a recommendation in support of this recommendation, and that is that the state parties to the Rome Statute must investigate and wherever appropriate, try the United States officials for crimes against humanity under universal jurisdiction. As far as universal jurisdiction is concerned, it should not be a surprise to the members of the press corps as to why we are demanding the enforcement of universal jurisdiction. The importance of universal jurisdiction lies in the fact that United Nations Human Rights Conventions, namely the Convention Against Torture, the Geneva Conventions, all mandate universal jurisdiction. That is, US officials can be tried by any state which is a party to the Rome Statute in respect of torture, in respect of crimes against humanity, and in respect of murder which have taken place in the United States, as these crimes are so serious that it is the duty, the mandatory duty of every state to pursue criminals, the United States officials, after they are investigated and they are found to have committed the crimes which they have committed in the United States against descendants of African Americans. The most important recommendations, one of the most important recommendations relates to reparations. Expert witnesses testified before us that it is not possible to bridge the gap between the African American community and the rest of the United States society, as for 4 centuries continuously there has been a history of slavery, of brutalization of the African Americans, of Holocaust, and for over 4 centuries, the gap has widened in the African Americans and the rest of society. Now, we are not asking or recommending charity. The commissioners have come to the conclusion that the capital accumulation from slavery actually built the United States of America and its economy. And without that capital accumulation, the United States would not have risen to be a great power. So therefore, what we are stating is that it is not possible for United States society, which is today fragmented between the races, to go back to normal unless actual reparations are carried out. And for this, the proposals that have been made are as follows. The US government's executive and legislative branches should acknowledge that the transatlantic trade in African enslavement, colonization, and colonialism and colonialism constituted a crime against humanity and are among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, Afrophobia, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Past injustices and crimes against people of Africa descent must be addressed with reparatory justice. As we all know, after the Second World War and the concentration camps and the Holocaust of the Jewish people, there were reparations paid to Israel and to all those who had been enslaved in the concentration camps and the slave industry of Nazi Germany. The same principle applies, and even more, because this is not a question of a decade of atrocities as were committed in Nazi Germany. This is a question of 4 centuries of atrocities and exploitation, and racism, which continues till date. The second recommendation on reparations is the US Congress should pass HR 40, the Commission to Study Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, to establish a commission to examine enslavement and racial discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present, and to recommend appropriate remedies. The Commission urges the United States to consider seriously applying analogous elements contained in the Caribbean Community's 10-point action plan on reparation, which includes a formal apology, health initiatives, educational opportunities, an African knowledge program, psychological rehabilitation, technology transfer, and financial support and debt cancellation. Third, enact the People of African American Descent and Indigenous American Atonement, Reparation, and Justice Act, with the objective of correcting structural racism in US society, which cannot be overcome without the legislation to facilitate mandatory representation in legislatures and public employment of these communities in proportion to the percentage of their population, to ensure their access to housing, nutrition, education, healthcare, social and other services, to atone for genocide and the seizure of their resources and the crimes against humanity committed by those who operated and benefited from the slave trade and subsequent human enslavement, which contributed to enormous capital accumulation and to subhuman status and acute disparities, which continues to adversely impact millions in the United States, fragmenting society along racial lines. I would like to emphasize here that we question the witnesses that without reparations, is it possible for the US society to normalize? Is it possible for African Americans to reach a level of equality with other citizens of the United States? And the answer of the expert witnesses was, without reparations, it is not possible to overcome the structural and systemic racism which has denied African Americans health opportunities, housing opportunities, educational opportunities. Though they are 13% of the population, their representation in the legislature, in the political executive, and in all areas of the administration of the United States is absolutely minuscule. And the commissioners have recommended that 13%, if they are 13% of the population, they must be given representation in accordance with the percentage of population, and the gap in health, education, employment facilities, nutrition at all levels, schooling, etc. must be bridged, because without that, there is no possibility of United States society normalizing. The next 2 recommendations are also extremely important, because there is a misconception about the situation, and we are finding that the citizens of the United States are very ignorant of what has been the situation and the status of African Americans, their contribution to the history of the United States. They are also ignorant of what happened to the Native Americans, the indigenous people, the genocide, and that is why there is a huge gap of misunderstanding on all these issues, which has resulted in fragmentation and an uprising in the society in the United States. So we have made 2 very important recommendations regarding the writing of history and the establishment of museums, and I would like to read out those recommendations. Appoint a commission of racially diverse historians and eminent persons with representation of academics of African descent, indigenous peoples, and immigrants from the Caribbean, Central and South America, among others, to review and recommend an objective presentation of the history of the United States, of events and people's movements, of the injustices and Holocaust against people of African descent over several centuries, of the genocide of the Native Americans, indigenous peoples, and the contribution of all races to the building of a society and nation. This history commission is a very important step towards making the United States a normal society where everyone has memories of the contribution of all these diverse minorities, in particular the African Americans and the Native Americans and the indigenous peoples, apart from other immigrants. The last recommendation on repetition is the establishment of museums and libraries. We find that history is being ignored in the United States and elsewhere. The actual history of the evolution of different civilizations, the origins of different countries, and the landmark historical developments of these countries, which would give people a better understanding of their society and also increase the level of culture and civilization, which is an integral part of civilization, which we find is missing not only in the United States, but in several countries all over the world. And therefore, our recommendation to establish museums and libraries that include accurate films and videos regarding the early history of the United States, the narrative of the slave trade and enslavement, the Holocaust of African descent in the US for 4 centuries, the history of the struggle for emancipation, the Underground Railroad, the civil rights struggle led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, and the contribution of the people of African descent, among other immigrants of color to the United States, including museums and libraries recording the history, life, and culture of indigenous peoples of the United States and the genocide and injustices perpetrated against Native Americans. It is by knowledge and understanding that racial profiling and violence will cease. Members of the press, I would like to make a special request. We have written this report, we have made various recommendations. But if our voice is to reach the UN Human Rights Council, the different states and governments represented in the United Nations Human Rights Council, and governments all over the world, the press corps will be playing a very vital and important role. And I appeal to you, because our first loyalty is to the human race. Our national loyalties come thereafter. And this is an issue of where 4 centuries of people who were enslaved and taken from Africa across transatlantic slave trade to the United States are still struggling for justice in the 21st century. Our duty to the human race mandates that the media, the press corps, individual journalists carry this report forward and present it not only in Geneva, but to the 4 corners of the world.
Oh, Commissioner Bagua, thank you for that powerful presentation of some of the recommendations. Okay, our final speaker is Commissioner Rashida Manjoo. Commissioner Manjoo is a former UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and a Professor Emerita at the University of Cape Town. Rashida?
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Geneva Press Club for organizing, for taking on the logistics of this press conference. And thank you to my fellow commissioners for their wonderful contributions, as well as participants for being here. I know that we are running out of time, so I'm going to try and keep this short. The commissioners have made the following recommendations. The US government should immediately ratify all international and regional human rights treaties, which the United States is not a party to. And just to remind us, the United States has signed but not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It has not signed or ratified the Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and their families, or the Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. So it is important that one takes note of, amongst all the treaties that exist within the United Nations system, let alone the regional systems, there are many that the United States is not a party to. Furthermore, the United States should remove reservations related to treaties that it has signed or ratified, including those stating that these treaties are non-self-executing, which basically means at the domestic level, it's a two-step process as opposed to self-execution of treaties as we find in many countries of the world. Thus, the Congress should remove the non-self-executing language in the ratification of, amongst others, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and or pass full implementing legislation of this treaty, including the provisions of Article 20. This Article 20 prohibits propaganda for war and speech that promotes hatred of racial or religious groups or incites discrimination or violence against people of racial or religious groups. In terms of treaties that the US has signed and ratified and is a party to, the US should fully implement, monitor, and enforce its obligations, emanating in particular from the International Covenant, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. To give effect at the domestic level to the obligations emanating from international and regional treaties, the US should create an interagency body composed of high-level officials from the executive, the legislature, and the judicial branches at both the federal and the state levels to take steps to give effect to these, to the decisions, the resolutions, the views, the observations, and recommendations of the United Nations and the regional human rights systems. The importance of ratifying and becoming a state party to a treaty was underscored for me last week when the United States government tabled its report to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And in Article 77 of that report on page 22, which has the title of Excessive Use of Force by Law Enforcement Officials, the government states in its report that efforts to address excessive use of force by law enforcement officials is underway. To make communities safer, we must begin by building trust between law enforcement and the people they are entrusted to serve and protect. We cannot hold that trust if we do not hold police officers accountable for abuses of power and tackle systemic misconduct and systemic racism in police departments. Now, an important aspect, and there is a paragraph 78, which acknowledges the tragic death of George Floyd, but not all the other testimonies that we've heard and all the other people that have killed in the US. But there are two important elements that arise from a state party report. And that for me is, one is the monitoring. So the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination now has the opportunity to monitor and review what the government is saying in its report and to make concluding observations in terms of failures or shortcomings that it finds. But the second important aspect is that a report to a monitoring body within the international regional human rights system, provides an educative accountability tool to civil society organizations. So when we have a report of this nature to a treaty body, we then have the opportunity to interrogate, to question, and to hold our governments accountable because of the obligations that have been undertaken through the ratification of treaties. Thank you very much, and thank you particularly to the families and lawyers who shared their time and their testimonies with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Manju, for that analysis. Okay, I'm going to Pierre, I don't know if you're going to step in now.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. So now we are ready to take some questions. To ask questions, to raise your electronic hand, you have to click on the button that is at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. It must be written reactions, in French at least. And you can click on that, and then you can click on raise the hand, and I will see your hands raised for those who want to ask questions. So please just use those tools. It's easy, and I will give you the floor as soon as somebody raises the hand. And please, if so, give us your name and your the name of your media. But perhaps in the meantime, before some other people and journalists want to raise their hand, I perhaps have one question myself. So, as you mentioned in your invitation, the Council for Human Rights will be in session starting on 21st of June. What do you very concretely expect from this session? What should be done and what can be done by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights? At what pace, and what concretely can you expect? I don't know who would like to answer this question. Perhaps just make a sign on the screen for those who would answer.
And I'm going to answer very quickly, but I see that Commissioner Bagwat would like to answer as well. So I want to say that one big hope from this session is that members of the Geneva community, so representatives at the UN missions and representatives from NGOs, we hope that they will champion our recommendations during the upcoming Human Rights Council session. We really, really want them to do that. Okay, and not only at the Human Rights session that's upcoming, but even moving forward to champion these recommendations, because we would like to actually see them implemented. Thank
you. Mrs. Bagwati, can you activate your microphone? And please, I think your microphone is the white little thing here you have before of you. It should be closer to your mouth because we can't hear you very well. Yes, probably it's better like that. Thank you.
What we expect from the UN Human Rights Council meeting and from the United Nations High Commissioner is that our recommendations are carried forward. And pursuant to the resolution passed last year, there are certain actions and steps which are being taken. And that report should incorporate the recommendations which we have made, particularly regarding the holding of a commission of inquiry, an expert to monitor continuous violation and racist systemic violence and violation of human rights of people of African descent which is taking place, and to direct the United States government to demilitarize their police forces on a priority basis, at the same time to call for an end to the impunity of police officials and to recommend that they be placed under independent review boards, their actions be scrutinized by independent review boards, and they be made accountable before the law in civil and criminal proceedings in the United States. Because presently, there is no accountability and there's complete immunity, as the police departments are acting in collusion with police unions and with the prosecutors and covering up these cases. So there have been few and far between prosecutions. The George Floyd case is an exception to the rule that there are no prosecutions against the police officer. So we expect that pursuant to last year's resolution, these specific recommendations be made in the report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to answer to this question? Just make a sign with your hand in case. If not, we had a question coming in by mail asking that first the President Biden will meet here in Geneva with Vladimir Putin on 16th of June. Is this an opportunity to go forward or to mobilize him in any way at this occasion? Is this an important rendezvous, you think, to make progress in this case of policy violence, or will his attention be totally elsewhere? Does somebody want to answer this?
Lennox, would you like to respond?
Yes, activate your mic, please. Mr. Hines, can you activate the mic?
Yeah, you're muted, Lennox. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In terms of the first question that was asked, what specifically are we asking the Human Rights Council to decisions to take, and what are our expectations? They're simple. There are 4 recommendations that are made, and they are spelled out on page 130 of the report. One recommendation is for the Human Rights Council to constitute a fact-finding commission with respect to the issue of systemic racist violence in the United States. This commission, whose report and findings we are rolling out today, was done by 3 sponsoring organizations, but these organizations do not have all of the resources that the Human Rights Council has. And so therefore, we do not want the report and our findings, although they are important, to be a substitute for the Human Rights Council undertaking their responsibility under 43(1). We also would like to have an independent expert dealing with systemic police violence to be appointed by the Human Rights Council. Another recommendation is a call for the demilitarization of the police. And as Commissioner Bagwat has said, the establishment of police control boards, that is, boards that are constituted and are capable of reviewing police conduct and holding the police accountable in the United States. Now, the last question you asked concerned what could we possibly expect, and is there opportunity when President Joseph Biden meets with Vladimir Putin on June 12th in Geneva? Yes, we think this would be an opportunity for the questions to be put very bluntly to Mr. Biden. As you know, President Biden has made statements to the extent that, unlike his predecessor, his immediate predecessor, he is now turning the page. He is now standing, and as he says, the United States is back, and the United States adheres to human rights. Well, we want to ask Mr. Biden, when will he, under his authority, sign the Rome Statutes and, in fact, send the document for ratification to the United States Senate? Now, this is something that he can do. This is something that he does not need the Congress to do. He himself can take this action. Now, why is this important? This is important to demonstrate that the United States, who holds itself to be a country founded on the rule of law, is prepared to, in fact, adhere to international human rights law. And if it is not willing to do so, then Mr. Biden has to answer the question, what is it afraid of? Why does it take the position that it can be the arbiter of human rights everywhere, but does not want anyone to, in fact, to hold it accountable? And we should put the question to Mr. Biden and watch him dodge and squirm.
Thank you very much. So I go back to Kerry Mclean. Do you perhaps want to wrap up this and conclude this this session? I guess yeah, we are about at the end. Or if you want to raise another question, the floor is yours, Kerry.
No, I'll go ahead and close. So I just want to thank everyone for joining this press conference. You heard from Philonise Floyd, whose brother George was a victim of racist police violence. You heard from 4 of our commissioners who presented findings of egregious violations of human rights and international law. You've also heard their recommendations for fighting and eradicating racist police violence in the United States. We ask that those of you in the Geneva community, in particular, those representing their countries at UN missions and representatives from NGOs, and everyone join us in this fight. And we really ask you to advocate for our recommendations at the upcoming Human Rights Council session and elsewhere. Please be in touch if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And you can find this video again, if you want to watch it again, on www.pressclub.ch at any time. Thank you, and I wish you a nice day.